My name is Joe Hotz. I'm at Duke University. I've worked on a number of different topics over the years, but sort of the last 5 years, most of my work has been concentrated on looking at families, and in particular, the way families work and sometimes don't work. The interesting part that has drawn me to this topic is we know a lot about how parents make investments in children, especially young children. And so HCEO has made, I think, and its researchers have made important findings with respect to the investments in young children and the importance of those investments over the lifetime. But we know less about what happens later in life, what happens to the relationship and investments, exchanges, transmission of advantage, inequality amongst parents and their adult children, essentially after the children leave home. Does it stop? Is, for example, the importance of these kinds of relationships stop later in life, and they become much less important as as the younger generation moves on, starts its own careers and their own families, etc. So, what's part of that issue that is, I think, important is part of the reason why we don't know much about this is because we don't actually have very much data. There are very few data sources which allow us to sort of look at what's the continuing or lack of continuing relationship between parents and their adult children. How much are they actually exchanging resources between the two generations as they're no longer living together? And so one of the things that I have spent a fair amount of my last 5 years doing is investing with collaborators in new data for this source. One is from a study, there's an ongoing study that's been going for 50 years called the Parental Study of Income Dynamics, a major source of data on families in America. But what we've done is sort of update and ask people about relationships between their children, and in particular how much money they exchange, exchange and how much time they spend with one another. I'll come back to the matter about time in just a second. But the other part I've invested in is a new data source which is currently in the field, which is taking an existing study which interviewed some 20,000 adolescents back in 1994, and we're now re-interviewing their parents and finding out about what's the relationship between those generations. Part of this is a concern about, and what motivates me is a concern about the whole issue of rising inequality in the United States. And again, we know from HCEO's work, Jim Heckman's especially, Lavio Cuna's, amongst others, right, that the family's investments, right, play a crucial role in inequality. Lack of investments in young children, especially those who are from more disadvantaged background, has lifetime consequences in terms of human capital, in terms of attainment in any number of different dimensions. The question that, as I said, it interests me is, does that inequality, perpetuation of inequality, continue as parents who have resources invest in their kids to go to college, and parents who don't have a much more difficult time? And that's a crucial issue with respect to the current climate in which we've known over the last 20 years that the cost of higher education has dramatically gone up much faster than any other activity within or commodity within the economic circumstances of America, or economic setting of America. But the other piece of this is to see whether there are other facets. So, for example, do parents have traditionally played a role in helping with housing? We've gone through a major transformation of housing in the United States over the last 15 years, from a huge boom, a housing boom, to a bust which is closely related to the Great Recession and its aftermath. What role have parents played in that? And again, has inequality been perpetuated when one set of families who have parents who have, are well-to-do, are able to help their children with housing, especially in more expensive housing markets, and other parents simply can't do that? Does it matter in terms of advancing a young person's career, as parents can help them possibly subsidize their investments in a career that maybe isn't very lucrative initially, but sort of has real advantages later on, and poor families simply can't provide that help. So a lot of what I've been doing is, of late, is developing the data for doing this, and now we're starting to look at it and starting to advance. So my current research is looking a lot at what role do parents play in investing in their children, in particular at the college level, where we're interested in, do parents invest in their kids? We know that, and we know that parents have used over the last 15 to 20 years essentially the value of their houses to be able to access different types of loans, so-called home equity loans. This is a phenomena that has grown in importance. And so we were asking, we were interested in the question, how do these investments work? Do parents use this to help fund their kids going to college? Second, a related point to this is we know over that same period of time, especially more over the last 10 years, there's been this dramatic rise in the incidence of student debt in the United States. More and more young people who advance to their career are starting those careers with a fair amount of debt. Well, do parents actually help with that debt? Do they help them absorb it? In fact, do they help co-finance it? It turns out that if you look at statistics from different sources, right, 15% of households which are headed by people 55 and over have student debt. Now, maybe that's their own student debt still lingering around, or more likely it's actually student debt because of their children, right? They've co-signed loans. And so one of the things that we're interested in is looking at how much do parents play a role, how much did the housing boom and bust affect parents' ability to invest, and what happened to different parts of the income distribution or housing distribution work? Did this advantage or disadvantage kids as we move through a period in which everybody was seeing a dramatic increase in their home values? We saw some of the highest rates of home ownership in the United States, to the period that were the aftermath, the Great Recession and its aftermath, in which those ownership rates have really gone down quite a bit. And indeed, many households found themselves many parents found themselves with home values which were, quote, underwater, right? They owed more than the house was worth at that point in time, so the ability to sort of take out loans for the purposes of sending their kids to college or doing any other number of different things were adversely affected. So we're very interested in not only what parents did to help or not help or be able to help their kids go to college, but what's the aftermath of that? Did it have consequences that it put parents more heavily into debt? Was it able to mitigate any of the debt that their children had? Did it affect the launching of the children's career? We know, do we see that sort of parents were able to sort of offset some of the student loans that kids were paying, that are in students' names, right, their children's names later in life, or not? So that's one of the big topics that we're working on. Another one we're working on is looking at, sort of the typical view is, and especially, sort of increasingly in America, the view is that, kids grow up, they leave home, and we're really talking about one-generational households. Well, in fact, it turns out that the incidence of 2 and 3 generational households has actually grown over the last 20 years in the United States. And that has consequences for not only, part of this was, more recently this was a result of the Great Recession, that many kids who couldn't afford to live on their own, young adult children moved back in with their parents. Some of that was out of economic necessity, but it turns out that it's not just that, right? There's been a longer term trend of going back to what was at the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century was quite common, which is, your elderly parent would still, or more often than not, your elderly mother would continue to live with you. Well, we've now re-examined that question and have work on what's happened to the patterns of that, and we look at sort of some interesting consequences of that. One is obviously sharing of resources in terms of housing can have beneficial effects for both generations. It can improve things like the potential connectedness of the older generation, and which is known to have consequences for improving people's health and longevity. But it also can have some adverse consequences in the following sense. One of the things we see is that households which are, quote, consolidate and they have multiple generations, that is, adult children, often are made up with children who, for various reasons, right, may have some disability, which may affect, like, for example, cognitive problems. Some of this is unfortunately related to drug use. But those long-term consequences for parents continuing to have, children living at home and possibly being responsible for those children in some way is a real issue. A related point to that is there's a lot of concern in the U.S. about the rising role of disability insurance and the costs of disability insurance funded through the Social Security Administration. One of the issues that many people are worried about is this abuse in that system, where sort of generations are gaming the system, if you will, by claiming a disability and then reaping the benefits. On the flip side, there is this phenomenon we're seeing, which is suggesting that, well, that may be true, but there's still this potential for a substantial burden going late into the older generation's life, right, where they're having some financial responsibility, if not other responsibilities for their adult children. So we're looking at those set of questions as well.